I'm going to go through my presentation. I've left time at the end for questions, and I hope we can have kind of an interesting conversation. We live in interesting times when it comes to face recognition technology. But before you can really talk about how computers see faces and recognize faces, you have to take kind of a step backwards and think for a minute about human face recognition. How do we see? Because it's actually an amazing thing that I don't think people appreciate enough. When a baby is in the womb, their eyes form, their eyes are closed while the retina is being formed. But as soon as the retina is done, they will start blinking. And if mom goes out into really bright sunlight, some of it can actually go through her stomach and the baby will start to practice seeing. But it's not really until they're born and open their eyes for the first time that they see, and they can see, which is amazing to me. So this is what we think babies can see. At birth, they can't focus. They can only see about 12 inches away. They don't have color vision yet. It takes about 6 more months for their vision to be fully developed. But at birth, a baby will prefer face shapes to non-shaped faces. So we already have an innate preference for people. And by 3 months, they're starting to develop color vision. They can start to see red. That's the first color that comes out, followed by the others. They can recognize their primary caregiver, as well as an adult can recognize a person that they know well. I mean, that's amazing. But it also kind of makes sense because we live with other people, we live in groups, and so being able to recognize your primary caregiver and the people who you're with is really, really important. Our brains are, and most people think that you see with your eyes. You actually see with your brain. Your eyes are the sensors that pull data in, but you spend about 30% of your brain processing vision and all of that data compared to about 3% for hearing. So it's a process that's going on. It's really complicated. It's really complex. It takes up a lot of time and processor, clock speeds. We are so good at finding patterns, and specifically faces. There's actually a specific part of the brain called the fusiform gyrus that is dedicated to looking for patterns and looking at faces. We're so good at it that we see them when they're not there. And this is pareidolia. People used to think it was a sign of mental illness. It's just your brain being so good at finding patterns and faces that it finds them even when they're not there. On the flip side, you can also have a condition called face blindness. It's very rare, and it's usually caused by some kind of a head injury, but there are some people who absolutely cannot recognize people. They just do not have the ability to make that connection and see the pattern. And if you think about when you see a person you know and you recognize them, it's really hard to understand how you do that. I mean, describe it to somebody else. How do you know that person? You just kind of do. To me, it's just an amazing thing that we're able to do. And here's one last example of what I think is just amazing. This is an image that you can see that represents a concept from entertainment. It's a TV show that's been on the air for a very long time. And most people, if they give it a little bit of time, will figure out what this represents. Has anyone figured it out? Okay, we've got a bunch of people. So it's this, it's The Simpsons. But think about this. Your brain was able to get The Simpsons out of, I think, 8 colors and 15 pixels. I mean, clearly that wasn't there. Your brain made that up and figured it out, and computers can never do that. Our ability to see is amazing. We see in context, and we see with the history of all of our past experiences. One last thing, it's almost mean to bring this up. Your nose is in the middle of your face. You can always see it. It is visible to both of your eyes 100% of the time when your eyes are open. And yet, unless you try to focus on it, you probably don't notice it. That's because your brain filters it out, except now I bet you see it. The other thing I think is really interesting is because of the way the retina is formed, there's actually a hole where the optic nerve goes through to the brain. And so you have 2 big splotches in the middle of your, well, just off to the side of your field of view, where there's a blind spot you absolutely cannot see. And yet you think you can see everything. That's because your brain is making stuff up and putting it in that gap. You can go online and Google blind spot test and get some things to see it. it's really kind of freaky to think, wow, I'm seeing things that aren't there. I literally cannot see that. My brain is making it up for me. There's also an online test for super recognizers. Some people are really bad at recognizing faces. It's just like most human skills, there's a bell curve. Some people aren't very good at it. Some people are really, really good at it. They're called super recognizers, and there's an online test you can take to see if you're one of them. And there's a couple of jobs that pay really well that are only for super recognizers, so it's worth checking out. So we're talking about really face recognition technology and human face recognition. And the thing I kind of want to point out is it's not 100%, and it never will be. Human face recognition isn't 100%. Here we have two celebrities who often get mistaken for each other, not the same person. On the other side, we have identical twins who frequently get mistaken for each other, not the same person. We've all had the experience of walking up to somebody and starting to talk to them and go, oh, I'm sorry, I thought you were someone else. Or what's worse, and what happens to me a lot, is somebody comes up and starts talking to you and you're thinking, oh God, I should know this person. Who is this person? Oh, it'll come to me. And maybe you get it, maybe you don't. But it's not something that's 100%. And we kind of want it to be, but it's just not. Human face recognition isn't 100%, and neither is it for machines. So the core concept for face recognition technology is we want to know, if I have a face, who is it? I mean, it's kind of a useful question. It's something that has a lot of applications. But it's actually a very complicated sort of brute force process. Any kind of classification system has two steps. You have to enroll an image, put it into the database, and so you would take a picture. This is a picture taken with a cell phone. It's 1.9 megabytes, pretty big, relatively. And that goes into the database with name, attribute, whatever else you have. And then you'll give a probe image that'll go to the gallery and be compared to say, is this that person? But one of the things that we do with enrollment images is we convert them to something called templates. Templates just a long string of complicated numbers that uniquely represents that person. But in our case, in our system, the template's about 400 bytes, much, much smaller. And the key thing about templates is a template can never go back to a photograph or an identity. It's always just an encrypted number. And that's a security feature. It also helps things go faster, because if we had to deal with 2 megabyte images, we'd never get anything done. After you've enrolled somebody and you actually want to find them, you send the probe image and it looks to the database. The first thing it has to do is find the face. And it's a brute force, high computational system. They're scanning and they're looking for something that vaguely is face shaped. Once they find a face, they'll start comparing, they turn that into a template, compare them to find the match. There's two different kinds of things that we do that we call face recognition, and they're different in ways that are kind of important. One-to-one matching or verification, you're probably familiar with if you have an iPhone. You take the phone, you take a picture, you say, I am Mary, this is Mary's phone. Now if I want to unlock my phone, it takes one more picture, and it verifies that this picture matches the one on the phone. One-to-one matching, it's relatively simple. If I want to do identification, which is, here's a picture, who is this? Especially if you have a large gallery, a record, a database with 1 million records, it's computationally a much more difficult prospect, and it's much harder to get right. I don't think people appreciate sometimes that those two things are very, very different. So let's talk about errors in biometrics. I already said it's not 100%. We kind of like it to be, I take a test, I can look at an answer, and they can say you got it right or you got it wrong. But if I look at a person and I say that's Bob, there's always a little bit of a doubt, because identity is probabilistic. So there's two kinds of errors. The first one, generally there's a couple of different names for it. I'm most comfortable with a false non-match. Two people are the same person. The system has incorrectly said this is not a match. It is a false non-match. The other kind of error is a false match. Two different people, the system incorrectly says they're the same person. Now, most of these technologies have their roots in law enforcement applications, actually in fingerprint sensors. Back in the 60s, when you needed to go find out if somebody was in a criminal database, they had warehouse-sized rooms with rows and rows of filing cabinets full of fingerprint cards on paper where somebody had been inked and printed. And they had what was called the Henry classification system, where each fingerprint had 5 different types, and there were other ways to classify it. So you would look at the latent print, very carefully trained for forensic examiners, and they could immediately figure out the classification type. So that was 1 and 5. We don't have to look at the 4/5 of the filing cabinets that for the other types. There were some other things to reduce the problem set, but then they would literally sit down, drawer by drawer, card by card, manually compare the latent print, to this card. Nope, go on to the next one. It could take months to find a match. And so they started looking for systems that could do this. And because they didn't really trust machines, and because they didn't really want machines to make matches, they designed them so that the computer really doesn't do the matching. It culls through the data set, eliminating things that absolutely cannot be matches, and then they're designed to give the best 20 candidates to a human examiner who will sit down and review them. Even if there's nothing in the database that's remotely close, it will find the best 20 and put them in there. But how do you know if it's a match or not? So you have to set a threshold. And again, this is all probabilistic and conditional probability. So at some point above which we think, okay, these two scores are so similar, it's a match. If they're so far apart, we're absolutely certain it's not a match. And this is a complicated area that I'm kind of simplifying. But remember, you have these two kinds of errors. They're inversely proportional. So I can actually tune my system, I can tune my algorithm to favor one or the other. So you might think that you would set your threshold right in the middle, where you get the lowest of both kinds of errors. But in practice, that rarely happens. So for example, in law enforcement, they're very, very concerned about missing a match. If there's a possible match, they want a human to review it. And so they tune them so they see every possible match. And that means they get a lot of false matches, a lot of things they have to look at that probably could never be a match. Just on the flip side, a lot of theme parks, Disney, Universal Studios, a lot of these large places, they use biometrics for their season pass holders. So they can just walk in and have a nice experience. They do just the exact opposite, because the odds that somebody is going to go into the line that's specifically for season pass holders without being a season pass holder is kind of low. It's well marked. You don't want to get caught. The fact that the system might accidentally mistaken that person for a true season pass holder and let them in is further still into, tiny, tiny, tiny. But the cost of annoying one of your best customers by making them present their biometric multiple times, it's very expensive. So they actually tune them quite the opposite. They make them a lot looser. It's easier to make a match. And okay, maybe once in 100 years they let the wrong person in, but oh well, I lost the fare for that one day's ticket. It's not a big deal. Really, what you need to understand is that depending on your use case, you need to tune these things differently, and there's no one right answer. It really just kind of depends. What are you doing with his identity? How important is it if you get it wrong? How important is it that you get it right? So let's talk about accuracy in biometrics or face. This has been in the news a lot, and there's a lot of misinformation, and there's a lot of things that I think really need to be talked about. So this is actually my co-founder. These two photographs were taken 10 years apart. He started running and lost 60 pounds. These both match just fine. It's not a problem at all. Here's a picture with some things that we did. These are things that people will commonly think will mess up face recognition systems. I'm just going to let you look at this for a few minutes and try to think which ones do you think will work and will fool an algorithm and which ones will not work. So all the ones across the top are fine. An algorithm will be able to get, isn't bothered by face paint. You can do, gems or sequins glued onto your face, hats, sunglasses, all of those things, not a problem. The one on the lower left, again, these are kind of black box systems. It's impossible to know exactly why, but my suspicion is because you can't see the eyes, you can't find the face. If you can't find a face, you can't match a face. And so I think that's what's happening there. And then if you distort the face shape enough, again, if the computer can't find a face and say this is a face, it won't be included as a candidate and even tried to match. And so you have to really come up with something pretty extreme to do that. And later, if you want to talk to me, I can give you all kinds of tips for avoiding face recognition if you don't want to be captured by cameras. The easiest thing in the world is just have your cell phone out, look down at it, and walk around. Because almost every camera is up at the corner, at above eye level. If you have your head down, they're going to be looking at the top of your head, not your face. Can't find a face, can't match a face. You don't really need anything super complicated. It's that easy. So one of the things I've seen in the news a lot, and it's kind of upsetting to me because I really respect the ACLU. I admire them. I think they do really, really good work. But they've been fighting against face recognition in a way that I think is really, it's just factually wrong. So they would take a picture of a politician or a celebrity or an athlete, and they would compare it to the mugshot database and say, look, we have 20 matches and they're all wrong. These systems are terrible. But remember what I told you earlier, they're designed to do that on purpose. You could give a picture of a cantaloupe to and have it matched against a mugshot full of criminals, and it will give you the 20 criminals that the algorithm thinks look the most like a cantaloupe. And that's okay, because the next step is a human will be given this list of candidates. They will one by one, they're trained and they have really detailed ways of doing this, and they will establish this person is not a cantaloupe and move on. The system is designed to work that way. So I think it's a little unfair to say, oh, they're highly inaccurate because they're coming up with false matches. Of course they are. They're designed to do that. There was another case I saw in the media that I thought, it was interesting in that I think it's scary, but it's also widely misreported. And so this is in Wales, in the UK. So the police put cameras all over a football stadium. I would call it a soccer stadium. And we don't know how many people are on the watch list. I wish I did, because I think that would be interesting. But there were about 170,000 people in the crowd, and they had multiple cameras, so they were presumably able to take pictures of all of them. And they searched them against this candidate list, watch list, which again, we don't know how many people, we don't know the quality. There's a lot of things that you really need to know that we don't know. And they came up with about 2,500 candidate matches. And out of those, when a human reviewed them, only 173 of them were actual criminals who were detained, and they did whatever they did because they're the police. Now, when this was reported in the media, they said, out of these 2,300, only 170 were real. This is terrible. It's a 29% error rate. These are terrible systems. They don't work. Well, again, the police were out there going, we caught 173 bad guys. This is awesome. We didn't even have to do very much. And I think the truth is somewhere in the middle. We're going to talk in a minute about conditional probability and the difficulty of doing mass surveillance, but just by its nature, mass surveillance is always going to have a high rate of false matches. And so can you say, is this terrible or is this great? I don't know, but I think you have to at least consider the experience of the, 2,000 people who went to go see a soccer game and had somebody tap them on the shoulder, and there's a police officer going, hey, can I see your ID? What's going on? They were seen in public by their friends as being questioned by the police. That would be terrifying. I would be very, very frightened. I would not like that experience. I wouldn't want my friends seeing that. And so to really decide if this is a good deal or not, you really have to also consider the harm you're doing when you're finding false matches, and think about that as well. If those 173 people were master villains from a Bond movie who were about to go destroy entire cities, okay, you might be able to convince me that that was a reasonable thing to do. I suspect these were actually more like to be 173 people who had overdue parking tickets, in which case this is not a reasonable thing to do. But the key thing is, I don't think police should be making these decisions. They're human beings. Of course they're going to want to use any tool that makes their job easier. I mean, I like to use all of the tools that make my job easier, but they shouldn't be making that decision. Other people should be making that decision, and there should be restrictions. And we have sort of precedents for this. In, what year is it? Recently, it's 2013. GPS location trackers started to get cheap, and they were inexpensive and small enough that you could just put them on cars pretty easily and then track the location of these people. And the police started using them. Nobody gave them permission, they didn't ask for permission, it's just new technology that helps them do their job. And they did for a while until it was contested in court. And what the lawyer said is, this is unreasonable search, it's unconstitutional. And the police said, well, we have detectives, and when we suspect somebody of a crime, we sometimes follow them. We're just using technology to help us do what we've been doing anyway. This isn't new. And the court said, well, you can follow one car. This technology allows you to follow all of the cars. And no, that's unreasonable. And so now, since 2013, you have to get a warrant to use a GPS tracker and put on a car. And I think that's kind of an analogy of where we need to go with some of the identity technology that's coming out. We need to have a thoughtful conversation about how do we restrict it and how do we use it appropriately. And it's really, really hard to talk about. And it's because it's probabilistic. And I'm going to use a medical example because I think it's a little easier to understand. And this is personal to me. I've been pregnant twice, and both times they do, and every pregnant person in America gets a really simple, non-invasive test, a test for Down syndrome. Both times I tested positive, which was really scary. And they said, don't worry about it, it's okay. What are you talking about? This is not okay. So the probability of actually your baby having Down syndrome is 1 in 800. Okay, it's not, I'd like better, but it's not terrible. The test itself has a false positive rate of about 0.05 and a false negative of 0.19. Again, hard to really understand what that means, but remember, we're talking about something that's super rare. If you test positive, there's a 2% chance that your baby actually has Down syndrome. I mean, that sounds crazy, but that's actually how the math all works out. And it's because, I mean, a test that's 99% accurate is going to be wrong 1% of the time. And if you're testing something for something that is much more rare than 1%, just the errors of the test are going to completely overwhelm the numbers of actual cases. And since you know that, you can choose to use this test in a certain way. And so this is a screening test. And after this, they ask you, okay, we have other tests that are more expensive, they're more invasive, they're more difficult. Do you want to do that? And then you can go get a test that will actually tell you, if your baby is healthy or not. But this was a terrifying experience to me as a first-time mother, and it was completely non-intuitive. She tested positive, clearly my baby has Down syndrome. No, it's only a 2% chance. But the analogy in face recognition is when we start using it for mass surveillance. If you're looking for something that's rare, and criminals are rare. I mean, people can talk about how this society is declining and everything's terrible, but actually crime is going down. Things are getting better. And so in general, criminals are very, very, very rare. So the likelihood that you're going to encounter one if you're filming large sums of people is much, much smaller than the accuracy of any kind of face recognition system, even really good ones. And so if you use it on large crowds of people looking for something that's rare, you are always going to be overwhelmed by false positives. So let's talk a little bit, we're going to transition to privacy laws, because I think we've made some good inroads, but I don't think we're quite all the way there. And there's still a lot of really bad information out. So this, I think, is really kind of scary. If the states in navy blue send their driver's license pictures to the federal government to be included in a face database. So Texas, you're already in there. We think about 50% of Americans are already in a database that the federal government has put together. The gray states do not. The blue ones will only send mugshots or limited amounts of data. But to some extent, your data is out there. Not just your face, but all kinds of information. So all of the privacy laws are really talking about identity technology, and it's important to realize that when we're talking about face recognition, that's one identity technology. There are lots. And if you're worried about mass surveillance, if you're worried about privacy law, you need to be worried about all of them. Current technology can do iris recognition. Iris is the colored ring around the pupil of your eye from 6 to 10 feet away. Without you doing anything. If you have your hands visible, you can get fingerprints, again, from at least 6 to 10 feet away. There's sensors that are just glass. You can just wave your hand over and at full speed get fingerprints. Faces, obviously, they have, can get a face image from very, very far away. But those are the really common modalities, but there's others. The way you walk. That is a unique human characteristic, and that can be recorded and used to identify you. We don't really do retina anymore, and we used to, and you'll see that in movies still. To collect a retina enrollment, you had to shine really bright lights into the back of people's eyes. It was painful. People didn't like doing it, and then to match, you had to do it again. And so, not a popular modality. Voice, gait, the way you type, and there's even an ear biometric. All of them are identification, and so all of them need to be considered if you're thinking about privacy. So GDPR is sort of the big privacy law that everybody's been talking about recently. It doesn't really apply to us here unless you have to either be operating from in the EU or working with people who are in the EU. So maybe it does, it kind of depends. But I like the sort of template that it is set, and we're seeing other people move in that direction. It's really common sense. Before you collect identity information, you have to have a reason, a business reason. You can't be collecting data just, for fun. You have to have informed consent, and it has to be real consent. It can't be a long list of fine print that they just click on OK. They have to specifically be asked, this is the data we're collecting, I'm informing you, is that OK? They consent. And if it's not required for the business use, it has to be optional. They have the right of access and erasure, which means at any time they can ask you, what data do you have on me? And you have to be able to answer that question pretty quickly. And they have the right to be forgotten or the right to have their data erased, again, in certain circumstances. You have to have an EU representative physically in the EU available to answer questions and to talk about any questions they may have, handle the right of access and erasure. And then the big thing is data breach, you have to be notified within 72 hours unless it's encrypted. If the data that was breached was encrypted such that it can't be used for anything, you don't have to notify them. So Illinois has, I think, the most interesting privacy law. Raise your hand if you've heard of BIPA. Okay, a couple people. The thing that makes it really unique, it has a right for private action, meaning if you as an individual can sue the company if they have violated this law. And given that it passed in 2008, and I don't think anyone actually noticed until like 3 years ago, there have been a lot of violations. The law basically says you have to get written release that says this is what you're collecting, why, and how long we're going to retain it. This next one, you have to have a public written retention policy, and that's another one that's gotten a lot of companies in trouble. They would have a retention policy, but they didn't make it public. That's a violation. There is really this was written with the intention of, they were worried about time clocks, biometric time clocks. And there are companies where they had people going into work, biometric is collected, leave at the end of the day, biometric is collected for years. Every single one of those collections is a violation, and it's worth $2,500. And the individual has the right to sue directly. They don't have to have the Attorney General bring suit. So it's been the source or the inspiration for a lot of lobbyists and a lot of money. Facebook, Google, all of them are facing massive fines, and they're fighting it very hard. So far, they've been totally unsuccessful. There are restrictions on how you can sell and share data, and you'll see this in a lot of the state laws. You have to store any of this identity data at or above industry standards, or as securely as the most confidential data that you have. Texas, I don't know that a lot of people realize this, has a biometric law, and it's from 2009. It's not very well written, but hey, it's better than nothing. It basically, again, they were thinking about biometric time clocks, so it really covers the relationship between a Texas employer and the employee. It says you have to get consent before collecting biometric or any kind of identity. You have to give them, inform them what you're collecting and why. They have to consent explicitly. You have to tell them if you have any plans to sell, lease, or disclose the data. There's restrictions on what you can do with it. You have that same reasonable standard of care for how you store the data, and you have to destroy it if you no longer need it or use it, and that's up to 1 year since you've last used it. It's kind of vague because it specifically applies to commercial use, which is not defined, and there's a couple of things that are in there that are a little odd, but still, it's a good start. Washington State was the next one to come up with a very specific law. This one applies to any company collecting for commercial use. Again, that's a little vague. But before you collect data, you have to inform people, this is what I'm collecting and this is why. You have to get explicit consent. And again, that's defined as, I didn't just glance through terms of service and click OK. You had to explicitly ask me, and I said it was OK in a way that was unmistakable. You can't sell, lease, or share the data without telling them. There's restrictions there. That same reasonable care standard for storage, and again, destroy when it's not in use anymore. So again, you're starting to see some similarities between all of these laws. California is the big one. It actually doesn't go into effect until January, and it's still in play. I think until just a couple of weeks ago, they still had 6 amendments, and so we weren't entirely sure how this was all going to shake out. It applies to any company with over 25 million in annual gross revenue, more than 50% of their revenue comes from personal data, or they sell more than 50,000 data points, Facebook. Before you collect data, you have to say what is being collected. You can't retain it if it's a one-time transaction. In other words, if you don't need to retain it for business use, you can't. And then we start to see very similar things. Disclose and sell, lease, or share data, you have to tell them, you have to get their permission. You have to update the privacy policy every 12 months, and that has to be published in a way that can be verified. That's going to trip some people up, I promise you. And then customers have to have 2 ways to request their data to be deleted. It can be a a phone number and a website link. It could be, I don't know, probably a billboard and something else, but there have to be 2 ways, and that's another thing that's going to trip up some people, I think. The other one, I'm trying to remember, they have a very sort of arcane description of like what concerns or what is a transaction. And so effectively, this is going to apply to a lot of people. Again, not until January. It's going to take a while to kind of shake out how this all works, but it's going to be interesting. Massachusetts has some proposed things that they're doing. They're going to have specific fines for each violation. It's very well supported. A lot of people in Massachusetts want a moratorium on all of it for government use. Again, people in general tend to be concerned about what the government is going to do with it. They're worried about living in a Black Mirror episode or having Big Brother over us now. Sure, I don't know that anyone who's for that, but that's something we absolutely need to be careful about. But that has not passed. There's a lot of other people who are proposing laws or beginning to propose laws or talking about it. All of them kind of follow that same format that you've seen. They have different determinations of what's personally identifiable information, and then New York and Maryland both have bills that are in committee now. And again, once the bill passed, and we're seeing this with GDPR, it's great that it passed, but there's still a lot of things that are vague. We don't really understand exactly what's required. We're going to have to go through court, have precedents set, get a general understanding of exactly what this all means, and it's going to be years before this is all worked out. Sorry. So just a summary, if you're going to be working with face, any kind of identity information, face, fingerprint, and iris are the common modalities. This is really kind of common sense. Only collect the information that you need to do whatever it is that you're doing. Get real informed consent. Don't try to hide it. Don't try to slip it through a terms and service. Actually, ask people, and if it's not required, you have to give them an option. Only retain data if you need it. Use best practices for storing that data, and then review, and I think right now the community kind of recommends every 6 months, review your policies, review your data, make sure we haven't had something change, some new data's come in, we haven't paid attention to it, it's not being protected the way it needs to be. But all of this is really common sense. I don't think any of this is onerous or difficult. Yeah, templates are similar to a hash. They're not a hash because you don't go to the same template every single time. You go to a very, 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 very similar template, which is where the probabilistic, conditional probability comes in. So, but that's effectively what templates are doing. Again, it's similar to a hash, but it's not literally a hash. Right, and that is effectively what we want to be really careful about. But I think the risk, it's a little overstated, but it's something that we need to be really, really careful about. Because of what I was saying with the conditional probability, it's really actually difficult to do this sort of Black Mirror-esque, everybody's being watched. I mean, there's so many false positives that it's like all of the data that we have that we don't actually look at. It's easy to collect it. It's hard to actually get anything actionable out of it. If you literally were collecting data on every person, there's no way we can process all that data or make any kind of decision based on it. So the risk isn't as high as people fear. And when you see every new technology that comes out, there is some amount of, okay, hang on, what's going on? It's the end of the world, it's the end of privacy, this is bad. And then we adapt. We come up with best practices, we come up with laws, we come up with regulations and ways of using the technology that's controlled. And we haven't done that yet. We don't yet know, does it require a warrant? Or maybe there's really no way to do this with a warrant. The police they just can't do it. I personally think that all of these identity systems should be opt-in and voluntary. If you are opting in and you choose to do it and you have an option, it's hard to see how that could really go badly. I'm a member of the TSA PRE program because when I fly, I don't want to take my shoes off. They're about to introduce face recognition, and so I'll be able just to walk through. I don't have to stop, give my driver's license to the guy. He doesn't have to scribble on it with really bad handwriting. I can just walk through, put my bag on the belt, and walk on. I'm a fan. I will choose to do that, but I will absolutely always want there to be a choice not to do that. Because me using this and me deciding to give my data to get something in exchange is very, very different from having something done to me. Well, one thing I was also going to say is we've actually seen this play out many, many, many times. I was reading, I just think the history of sort of how we adopt new technology is really interesting. When cars first came out, there were all of these people writing to the paper, incensed and terrified. It was going to be the end of society because they were in the way of people. These paths and these roads were made for people and for pedestrians, and these cars were taking up all the space, and they would hit people. And there was the Gilbert and Sullivan, I can't remember his name, he actually wrote a letter to the editor. He said, we should be allowed to just shoot on sight, discourteous drivers. They're a menace, and these cars should just go away. Okay, that didn't happen. When Kodak came out with portable cameras, cameras used to be really big, the old school. When they came out with portable ones, again, this is the end of privacy. You can just go out and people could be taking your picture and you don't even know. This is the end of society, it's the end of privacy. This is a terrible, terrible thing. But we adapted. And we now really don't have that much concern with digital cameras. My favorite one is in the 70s. There's a whole series of books. Again, it's the end of privacy. It's the end of society. The sky is falling. And this is in the 70s. So can anyone guess what technology was being introduced that introduced such fear? It was the relational database. Because until then, data was siloed. And you kind of, left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing. And there's some advantages to that. Now there's going to be one global database where everything about you is there. The government's going to know. They're going to be tracking you from birth to grave. It's the end of the world. Didn't really happen that way. And I think relational databases are pretty useful. I think we're going to see something similar here. We're going to adapt. We're going to come up with rules and restrictions and things that we can and can't do with identity. Some of it will be legal, some of it will be cultural, and we will move on and find a way to use these in ways that help us and prevent people from using them in ways that hurt us. Well, we've already made some decisions about what you have to do to travel. You have to have some kind of ID and identify yourself to enter the country or to enter a foreign country. If you want to go to Britain, you have to give them some kind of identification, and they get to say, no, we don't want you. You have to get a visa, and they can say, yeah, I don't think so. You can't get a visa, you can't come in. We've decided that that's okay. Same thing with air travel. I'm not really sure how or why, but we've decided it's okay to identify yourself. I think it's really interesting because I'm a libertarian. I've never been through that machine once. I opt out every time, and I travel a lot. People at the airport know me. I just don't like them. And honestly, I've gotten asked over and over again, okay, it's not that big of a deal. It's not going to give you cancer. And I say, honestly, it's just because I can. I think we have to exercise our rights or we'll lose them, and so I'm opting out because I can. But having said that, when they started doing face recognition at the port of entry at Dulles, the Washington, D.C. airport, in the first week, they found 3 people with fake passports coming in from foreign countries into the United States who had passports that resembled them but were not them. And then they had a separate set of documentations hidden in a secret pocket in their bag. 3 people in the first week. I can argue on whether we should have the identity of people who come in. We can go into immigration politics. But we have decided that we get to decide who comes in, and so the fact that we found 3 in 1 week is a little unnerving. Who are these people? What are they doing? Why aren't they using their regular passport? What's up? I don't know. I think there's a fine balance between we have a police force, and again, I'm a libertarian, but I still want to have a police force because I'm small. I was the nerdy kid in school. I needed somebody to watch out for me because if we're going to live in mob rules, I'm going to be somebody's property. So if my house is getting broken into, I'm not going to stand up and handle that. I'm going to call 911. I have strong issues about how we do policing, things that we should do differently, but at the end of the day, I would rather have a police force than not have one. Again, that's because I'm small. Other people may feel differently. So these are the kinds of conversations that I think are really important to have. If it's to be truly opt-in and voluntary, that can't be lip service. It has to truly be opt-in and voluntary. It may be a pain to opt out at the TSA, if I'm not because TSA, you don't have to go through those machines, which is one of the reasons I joined the program. But if occasionally I don't, they don't print it on my boarding pass, I have a choice. I can just go through the machine if I want to that one time, or I can opt out. As long as that's a real choice, then it's a real choice. But the only reason we'll get to keep that as a real choice is if people use it, and people take advantage of that and actually don't. And right now, the non-TSA line is always longer than the TSA line. It costs money, it's a pain, you have to go give them your identification, you have to go register. It's kind of difficult, so I don't think, at least right now anyway, that that's my biggest concern. I don't think that a machine can have bias. It's an algorithm. But machines are built by people, and people absolutely have bias. And we build them to do a task, and that task was built on how a person thinks that task should be done. And so there's a whole set of assumptions in that. And in general, for machine vision, when you're going to train an algorithm, and this is a gross simplification, we don't actually know how they work. Back 10 years ago, face rec isn't new. We would use a thing called eigenfaces, which was basically linear algebra. You could kind of think of a face represented as a series of faces all laid on top of each other. So it would be like, well, my face is 20% of Susan with a -5 of Bob, and these 3 people, and that all combines to be me. So it was this really complex, and it worked okay, 80%. We don't do that anymore. Now we've got deep learning and AI, and it's all just a black box neural net. We feed it a ton of trained data sets. These are 2 people who are the same face. more data the better. These are two people who are not the same face, and with massive amounts of data, then you start telling the computer, okay, tell me, do they match or not, and you check it, they get really, really good. But those algorithms are only as good as the training data. So if you put your training together well, and this is an art more than a science, you'll get a very accurate algorithm, and there's some really good ones out there. If you put your training set together badly, you're going to get garbage in, garbage out. And so there were some early algorithms that really, they were all trained on white college students because those are the faces that are cheap and easily available. And so they worked really well on 20-year-old white guys and not as well on other people. Since then, people have improved algorithms. They're constantly trying to come up with more data, make them better, and make them more robust. But again, identity is not 100%. Any given group of people, it's not going to be the same because humans can't do it that well. I'm trying to remember the name of it. There's actually a name for this, and it's true. People recognize their own, the group of people that you grew up in, you will recognize them better than the people you didn't grow up with. So if you grew up on an island with Alaskan Inuits, you would see all kinds of differences in their faces, and you would be able to recognize Eskimos with huge details. They all look the same to me. And then if you take that person and then go move them to America, they look at all these white people and go, man, they all look the same. That's because our brains are just, that's how we trained the brain, the algorithm. You grew up seeing a certain set of faces. We're really good at recognizing faces that we are already familiar with. We're really not very good at recognizing unfamiliar faces, not nearly as good as we think we are. The advantage a computer has is it can look at 1 million faces without getting tired. It's a tedious, repetitive task. People are not very good at it. Computers aren't 100%, but neither are people. Does that make sense? Again, there are huge issues of bias, specifically in policing, but honestly, and this is sort of a contrarian position, I think algorithms are going to do more to help than to hurt, because bias comes from people. And one of the reasons I was telling you for fingerprint analysts, they're always given 20, and that's on purpose, because they don't want the person to just let the machine do something. If the machine says, oh, here, there's one candidate, I'm not even going to look at it. Yeah, that's it. If I get 3, the top one's probably it. If I get 20, none of these are a match. I stop doing it because it's a tedious, repetitive task that people aren't good at. So they specifically give them 20 and force them to analyze all 20 of them. Even if the first one's a match, you have to go process all 20 of them, and you send that to somebody else. And if there is a match, it's double-checked by an independent person who doesn't know the answers that you got. Because it's a very, very difficult task. It's difficult to do well. It's difficult to do without bias. Okay, well, if there's no other questions, thank you. It's been a pleasure to come here today.